1983's The Prey is a movie that I should dislike on all accounts, but ultimately find extremely charming in what it is able to do when compared to what it is trying to achieve. It is technically a pretty bad movie, but still with that, there's just something about it that really works on an artistic level. Although you can probably tell from the length of this video that there ultimately is still not a ton to talk about with it. Coming from the height of the early 80s post-Halloween slasher boom, from its outset it is primarily doing things that you have seen a dozen times before. A group of campers go hiking in an area that is known for disappearances. A handsome forest ranger comes after them because he's worried for their safety. They start getting picked off one by one as they realize that there's a killer in the woods with them. You know, very standard by-the-books horror stuff of its day. But where it differs is in its execution, where it is doing some really interesting things that may or may not be fully 100% intentional, and may ultimately be the result of an exceptionally low budget, but nevertheless, the end results are captivating and compelling for them. Now, first of all, the film was released in 1983, but was actually shot over the course of 10 days in the summer of 1979, and as such feels more like a 70s movie than an outright early 80s slasher, which did have very different distinctive tones. The filmmakers cited The Hills Have Eyes as their major inspiration on this film, and that is very clear when watching it. But a lot about this feels like it's going against what horror was doing at the time. There's nothing sensationalist about this for the majority of its runtime, and even comes across as being naturalistic to a fault, not just in its performances, but also later when we get to the violence in the film. None of it is built or structured like a kill normally would be in a horror film, with instead every instance being quick and nasty. Almost documentary-esque in how it is presented to us. And I don't know how much of it is intentional and how much was a result of a lack of skill. This was the only horror film that Edwin Brown, the director, would ever make, and would later on spend the rest of his career making direct-to-video pornography. This is kind of his only major artistic output, and the decisions that are being made here are so strange and surreal at times that even if done out of a lack of raw, unrefined talent, they still land because of their strange tone. It's only 80 minutes long, but it somehow feels slow. The majority of the conversations in the film are ultimately meaningless, and were not even scripted. They just had the actors improvise what conversations they might have if they themselves were on a camping trip with their friends in this situation. And this is intercut with stock footage of predators eating prey and vultures flying over their heads. It feels exceptionally art house in presentation, and even though this stock footage was almost certainly a cheap technique that was being used to get this bare-bones film to a runtime that was even moderately acceptable, it somehow actually creates a mood of impending danger that is really unlike a lot of work that was being produced in this time. The monster who's following them, by the way, is only the fourth screen credit of Carol Strachan, the giant from Twin Peaks, although you'd never really know it, even in the final shots where you get to actually see him in full body. The makeup effects in these shots greatly detract from the overall film, and I think if they couldn't have gotten appropriate makeup, they should have avoided showing the creature at all except for occasional cut-in shots of his hands and stuff like that, which they do for the first sections of the movie, because including him fully in these last scenes does hurt the film. But despite that, this is at times quite gorgeous to look at. It has its merits as a work of art, and the cast all do really well with what little material they have for the most part. And you're left with this amalgamation of things that one would associate with a run-of-the-mill slasher, that is all being presented to you through a lens that feels totally foreign and strange. That all builds up to one of the weirdest and most horribly, almost inappropriately bleak endings to a slasher film that honestly totally redeems any shortcomings that the film otherwise might have. And if you don't want to have this spoiled, please stop watching now, because they don't make it out of this situation. Everybody, including the handsome forest ranger, dies at the hands of our monster. And we're left with a final girl who does not fight back and instead cowers in fear as the monster corners her in the woods, leaving us with a final shot sometime later of a foggy cave deep in the mountains, as the cries of a newborn baby echo from within. And then we just cut to the credits, and we are left with this feeling that we have seen something that totally violates any traditional standards of horror cinema, or even the general consensus of taste. And The Prey ends up being a film that stands completely on its own trashy artistic ground, making it this severely underwatched, kind of bad but also kind of fascinating little film that you might be bored of while watching it, but will inevitably probably stick with you longer than you might expect it to.